I've always loved the idea of getting away from it all. The thought of spending time alone in a secluded cabin surrounded by wilderness sounded perfect. No distractions, no noise, just peace. In 2017, after a rough couple of years, I decided to book a weekend getaway. I found a cabin deep in the forest of upstate New York. It was tucked away from everything, reachable only by a narrow, bumpy road that twisted through thick woods. The cabin itself was small but cozy, just what I needed to clear my mind. The drive was long, about 3 hours from the nearest town, but it was worth it. The moment I pulled up to the cabin, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The air was crisp, the trees thick with greenery, and the only sound was the occasional chirp of birds or rustling leaves. It felt like the kind of place where time slowed down, where you could truly unwind. I unpacked my things quickly and set up inside. The cabin was well stocked, an old wood stove for heating, a few basic kitchen utensils, and a small table by the window that overlooked the forest. The owner had left a note explaining how everything worked, and I made sure to follow it carefully. It was a simple, one-room cabin with a loft for sleeping, and the rustic charm of the place was exactly what I was looking for. The first night was peaceful. The stove crackled as I made a simple meal, and I spent a few hours reading by the window, watching the fading light outside. I hadn't been alone in such a serene spot for a while, and it was exactly what I needed. By 9 p.m., I was already in bed, tucked under a thick blanket, listening to the sounds of the forest. The night was still, and the only thing I could hear was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The room was dark, and I couldn't figure out what had disturbed my sleep. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard something else. A faint noise, like footsteps outside. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just an animal, but the sound was deliberate, slow, as if someone was walking around the cabin. My heart rate quickened. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It was probably a deer or some other animal. But then the sound came closer, the footsteps moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I lay in bed, completely still, straining to listen. My mind raced. What if it wasn't an animal? What if someone was out there? The footsteps stopped near the back of the cabin. My throat went dry, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had locked all the doors when I arrived, and I was sure no one should have been able to get in. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was outside, watching. The sound of their movements was unmistakable, slow and cautious. I held my breath, waiting, listening to the silence that followed. A few minutes passed, maybe longer, and then I heard something else. A faint tapping on the window. It was so quiet that at first I thought I imagined it. But then the tapping came again, a soft, deliberate sound. I froze. I don't know how long I lay there, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to hope it was just the wind or an animal, but something deep inside told me that wasn't the case. I slowly got out of bed and crept toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I parted the curtains just enough to peer outside. First, I saw nothing. The darkness was thick outside, and the cabin was surrounded by shadows. But then I caught movement. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, partially obscured by the trees. They were just standing there, motionless, staring at the cabin. I pulled back from the window, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. The person didn't move. They just stood there, watching the cabin as if waiting for something. I couldn't see their face, but I knew I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The cabin was too remote for cell service. I was on my own. I thought about leaving, but I couldn't risk running into whoever was outside. I didn't know if they were armed or dangerous, and I didn't want to take any chances. The only option left was to stay hidden until morning. The hours seemed to drag on. Every creak of the cabin, Every rustle of the wind outside made my nerves jolt. I barely slept, my eyes darting between the window and the door, half expecting to see someone standing there at any moment. As dawn approached, I slowly allowed myself to relax. The figure outside had disappeared. I tried to convince myself that it was just someone else in the area, maybe a hiker or a camper who had lost their way. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When the first light of day broke through the trees, I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things quickly, determined to get out of there and head back to town. I didn't care if I had to walk all the way back to the main road. I just needed to be somewhere safe. The thought of staying another night in that cabin filled me with dread. I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the gravel path. The forest was eerily quiet. There was no sign of the figure from the night before, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time the wind rustled the leaves, I turned my head, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a tree. I walked quickly, my steps quickening as I got farther from the cabin. The woods seemed endless, the trees towering over me, casting long shadows as the sun began to rise. Every crack of a twig or snap of a branch made my heart race. I tried to focus on the path ahead, telling myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. When I finally reached the main road, I saw a car in the distance, a sign of civilization. I waved it down and the driver stopped. I climbed in without hesitation, grateful to be away from the woods. The driver, an older man, asked if I was okay. I must have looked shaken because I could barely speak. I told him about the strange figure at the cabin, and he nodded slowly. Yeah, I've heard about that cabin. Some folks say it's haunted. Others say it's just a place for people to disappear. Not many go out there anymore. That's when I realized how lucky I was. There had been no sign of the person I saw outside. No evidence of anything out of the ordinary. Maybe it was all just my overactive imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister had happened in those woods. The cabin was too far from the main trail. Whoever had been out there was experienced enough to know how to move quietly and blend into the shadows. I never went back to that cabin. The memories of that night stayed with me, haunting me whenever I ventured too far into the woods. It was the isolation, the quiet, that made it so eerie. Out there, you're on your own. And sometimes that's the most terrifying part. It was late October, and the air had a certain sharpness to it, as if the earth was bracing itself for winter. I'd been looking forward to this weekend getaway for months. A small cabin in the woods near Lake Echo, about an hour outside of the town of Green Creek, seemed perfect for a quiet retreat. I'd heard about the place from an old friend who had gone there for years, but this was my first time. I'd been feeling a bit burnt out from work and needed the isolation. When I arrived at the cabin, the place seemed exactly how I'd imagined, rustic and secluded. The weather was cold but not unbearable, with a heavy blanket of clouds hanging over the trees. The leaves had already started to change, the reds and oranges filling the forest like a painting. I was alone, just me and a few days of solitude. As soon as I stepped inside, I noticed the strange stillness of the cabin. It was far too quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the isolation. The furniture was old but comfortable enough. The wood floors creaked with each step, and the scent of pine and old wood lingered in the air. I settled in, unpacked my things, and started a fire in the small stone fireplace. The warmth was comforting against the chill outside. That first night was uneventful, but the silence lingered. There was no sound of animals, no rustling of the trees in the wind. I couldn't even hear any distant cars. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the cabin as the night stretched on. felt like the world had forgotten this place. The next day, I decided to take a walk along one of the trails near the cabin. It was peaceful at first, just the crunch of leaves underfoot and the rustling of branches above. But as I walked deeper into the woods, something began to gnaw at me. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a feeling, a deep, unsettling sensation that I wasn't alone. I stopped trying to shake the feeling off, but it wouldn't go away. There was something off about the air, the way the trees loomed so close, as though they were watching me. I took a few more steps, and that's when I smelled it. At first, it was faint, just a strange, musky odor that drifted past. It was strong, sour, almost like wet fur and dirt, but not quite. I stood still, hoping the smell would pass, but it didn't. It only grew stronger. I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing there, just the same dense forest, stretching on for miles. I felt my heart rate pick up, but I forced myself to keep walking. The trail wound further, leading me deeper into the woods, but the further I went, the more I felt like I was being followed. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though I couldn't see anything. My steps quickened, but just when I thought I might be overreacting, I heard something, a distant thud, like a tree falling. But it wasn't the sound of wood hitting the ground. It sounded heavier, more deliberate, almost like something large was moving in the woods. I froze. There was no wind. The trees didn't sway. The leaves didn't rustle. It was silent again, that heavy silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being surrounded. I decided to head back, but as I turned to retrace my steps, I noticed something else, a faint humming sound. It was low, almost like a distant engine running, but it was strange, almost as if it were coming from deep within the earth. My stomach twisted with anxiety. I forced myself to keep walking, nearly running now, my boots crunching against the underbrush. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath coming in quick gasps. I locked every window, bolted the door, and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. There was no reason to be scared. But then the night fell. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. I tried to read, but I couldn't concentrate. Every time I thought I heard something, I'd freeze, straining to listen. The wind or something else? I didn't know. And then it happened. A knock. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe an animal. But then, it came again. 2 heavy knocks, followed by a long, drawn-out scraping sound on the wood. My blood ran cold. I wasn't imagining this. The knocks were too deliberate, too purposeful. I crept to the window and peeked outside. There was nothing there, just the dark expanse of the woods. I sat back down, trying to shake off the panic creeping up my spine. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I felt sick to my stomach. The quiet was back again, but this time, it felt like the kind of silence that wasn't normal. Around midnight, it started again. The hum. The sound was low, rumbling, and unlike anything I'd heard before. It didn't seem to come from anywhere, but it was as if it filled the air itself. My head felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. The pressure built, making it hard to breathe. Anxiety washed over me like a tidal wave, and I had to fight to keep my mind from spiraling into panic. I thought I saw something outside the window, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there, just shadows. I grabbed my phone, checking for a signal. None. The thought of leaving the cabin crossed my mind, but the forest was so dark, and I didn't know what was out there. Something didn't feel right. I managed to sleep for a few hours, but when I woke up, I knew something was off. The smell from earlier, the musky odor, was back. Stronger now, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I couldn't tell if it was from outside, but it was unmistakable. It made my stomach churn. I went outside, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But the moment I stepped off the porch, I knew something was wrong. The woods were eerily still, no sounds at all, not even the usual rustling of the trees. I took a few steps into the woods, trying to force myself to stay calm, but that feeling was back, the feeling of being watched. And then, in the distance, I saw it, a figure, large, dark, and standing motionless between the trees. It was almost too still to be real, like it was just part of the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of something massive. It didn't move at first, just stood there as if waiting. The air around me seemed to hum with that strange, low frequency again. I felt my body freeze, my feet glued to the ground. I couldn't look away, but my gut told me to run. The figure shifted, just a little, enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts a blur. I slammed the door shut, locking it as quickly as I could. The rest of the day was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, of being hunted. The low hum was constant, rattling my nerves, and I felt dizzy from the pressure. I kept hearing things, branches snapping, footsteps, even the faint sound of what seemed like a human voice. It was muffled, distorted, and I could never quite make it out. It didn't sound like a person, but more like something mimicking human speech, warping it. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was done. I couldn't stay another night. The forest was no longer a peaceful retreat. It was something else now, something hostile. The thought of driving back through that dark road to town was the only thing keeping me going. I packed up my things in a hurry, barely taking a second to look around before heading to my car. The woods seemed to press in around me, as if they didn't want me to leave. But I drove straight through the night, barely stopping for gas, until I finally made it back to Green Creek. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I wasn't sure what it was, whether it was a Bigfoot, something else, or just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew one thing: I wouldn't be going back to that cabin again. Not ever. And whatever it was out there, it was something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the infrasound that I'd read about, maybe it was something I couldn't understand, but the experience left me shaken. The fear was real, and whatever was out there in the woods, it was real too. I was spending the weekend with my girlfriend, Jenna, at a cabin deep in northern Ontario. The cabin was one of those older frames, isolated and far from anything resembling civilization. We had spent a couple of days hiking, fishing, and just enjoying the silence of being completely off the grid. The kind of silence you can only get when there's no cell service, no cars passing by, and no one else around for miles. The cabin had no electricity, so the nights were lit only by lanterns and a wood-burning stove that we kept going to stay warm. The loft we were sleeping in was cozy, even though the floors creaked a little under every step. I loved the quietness up there, where we could hear nothing but the wind and the occasional rustling of branches outside. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world, and there was something strangely comforting about that. The loft was pretty high up, with a window that overlooked the small wooden deck where we had set up our chairs and fire pit earlier in the day. That night, we were both tired, ready to call it a day after a long hike. Jenna had fallen asleep beside me, the sound of her breathing light and steady. I just started to drift off too, the flickering light of the lantern casting soft shadows around the room, when I woke up to something that made my heart race. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. Clear, unmistakable footsteps on the deck just below the loft window. One step, then another. Slow, deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding. I tried to shake the sleep out of my head, but the footsteps continued, each one louder than the last. I didn't want to wake Jenna, not yet. I sat up quietly in bed, my eyes darting toward the window. It was dark outside, the kind of darkness where you couldn't see anything beyond the small circle of light coming from the lantern on the bedside table. But I knew someone was out there. It wasn't a wild animal, it was too deliberate, too human. I climbed out of bed, my feet hitting the cold wooden floor, and I made my way to the window, careful not to make a sound. The cabin creaked as I moved, the floorboards groaning under my weight. I pulled back the curtain just a little, peering out into the night. Nothing. The deck was empty. No sign of anyone. I felt a cold sweat trickle down the back of my neck. But just as I was about to pull away from the window and write it off as my imagination, I heard something else. The sound of the door, our cabin door, creaking open. It was that unmistakable screech, the kind of sound a door makes when it hasn't been used in a while and the hinges are rusted. The door to the deck hadn't been opened all day, and it was still locked. I froze. There was no wind, no storm, nothing that could have caused the door to open on its own. My heart was in my throat. I watched, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something, anything to move. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Just the creaking of that old door hanging wide open, as though someone had casually walked up and opened it. Couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure if I should call out or stay silent. I looked at Jenna, still fast asleep, oblivious to what was happening. I didn't want to scare her, but I couldn't ignore it either. Slowly, I grabbed the flashlight from the table, clicking it off to conserve the battery. The only sounds I could hear were the steady thrum of my pulse and the wind whistling outside, rustling the trees. I stayed by the window for what felt like forever. It was eerily still. My eyes scanned the deck below, my mind racing. Was it a bear? Could an animal open the door like that? No, I didn't think so. Bears are curious, but they wouldn't open a door and stand there. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Time seemed to move differently in that cabin, especially in the middle of the night when everything was so quiet. The more I waited, the more I began to second-guess myself. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps. But the door, why was it open? An hour passed, maybe two. Couldn't be sure. It was getting harder to keep my eyes open, the exhaustion from the hike starting to take over. I had to know if something was out there, though. I had to make sure everything was locked, secure. I quietly climbed down the ladder from the loft, the steps creaking under my weight. I was careful not to wake Jenna. I grabbed the lantern from the table, its soft orange light flickering in the stillness of the cabin. The door to the deck was still wide open, the hinges protesting with that same screech as I approached. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The deck was empty, just as I expected. There were no signs of anyone, no footprints in the dirt, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It was almost too quiet, like the whole world was holding its breath. I walked over to the door, slowly pushing it closed. The wood groaned under my hand as I secured the latch and locked it. It was strange how simple actions, like locking a door, could feel so significant in a place like this. As I turned around to head back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still watching me. I made my way back into the cabin, double-checking the other locks on the windows and doors. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched from the woods, but there was no one there, nothing. I checked the windows, making sure they were secure, but even as I did, I couldn't shake the strange sensation in the pit of my stomach. I finally climbed back up the ladder to the loft, my body tense, every noise outside making me jump. Jenna was still asleep, oblivious to everything that had happened. I lay back down beside her, staring at the ceiling, the stillness of the cabin settling over me. But I couldn't relax, not entirely. The door, the footsteps, something wasn't right. It wasn't until morning, when the sunlight finally started to creep into the cabin, that I allowed myself to breathe again. I'd made it through the night, Whatever had happened, whatever was out there, hadn't come back. The daylight brought with it a sense of relief, but the unease I felt never fully left me. I didn't say anything to Jenna. She was just as happy to be out there in the woods, away from everything, as I was. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The door, the footsteps, the silence that followed. We spent the rest of the day outside, enjoying the crisp fall air, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept my distance from the deck, from the door, not wanting to tempt whatever might be out there again. The thought crossed my mind that it could have been someone else, someone who knew the cabin was here, someone who was looking for trouble. But there was no sign of anyone, not even footprints in the dirt. No tracks, nothing. By the time we packed up and left the cabin a few days later, I had convinced myself that it was just the isolation, the quiet that had played tricks on me. Maybe I had heard animals or the wind, and the door had just been loose. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the full story. I didn't like the feeling I had gotten that night, the feeling that something or someone was out there. It was late summer when I decided to take a solo trip to a cabin in the woods. The area was pretty remote, tucked away in a part of the mountains I'd never explored before. The kind of place where your phone has no signal, and the only sounds are the wind, the rustling leaves, and the occasional bird call. I wasn't bothered by the solitude. I liked being alone out there. It gave me a chance to disconnect and just focus on the simple things, like fishing, hiking, and breathing in the clean, crisp air. That weekend, I'd been fishing by a small, secluded lake, tucked deep in the trees. It was a good spot. Lots of quiet, no crowds, and the fish were biting well. I was there most of the afternoon and into the evening, enjoying the peace of being out on the water as the sky slowly turned orange and pink with the setting sun. I didn't plan to stay out that long, but I lost track of time. The temperature started dropping as the sun set behind the mountains. I packed up my gear, feeling the chill of evening settling in. The path leading back to the cabin was about a 30-minute walk, and the woods were thick, the trees closing in around me as I made my way through the dimming light. It was around the time when I noticed it, an odd feeling creeping over me, a kind of heaviness in the air, like something was watching me. I paused on the trail for a second, listening. All I could hear was the wind, rustling the branches of the trees. But then, there was a noise off to the side, something moving in the underbrush. It was too soft to be a bear or a deer, too deliberate. First, I shrugged it off. It was probably a raccoon or some small animal, but then I heard it again. A snap of a twig, followed by soft footsteps in the dirt. Something was definitely out there. I kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. My heart started to pick up a little speed, and my hand tightened around the handle of my flashlight. The light was weak, but it was enough to show me a faint path in front of me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Then I saw it, off to my right through the trees. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow really, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make it out clearer. It was a creature standing low to the ground. It looked like an animal, but not like any animal I knew. It was large, maybe the size of a wolf, with pale white fur that almost blended into the moonlight. But what caught my attention most were its eyes. Glowing, reflective, and bright like the headlights of a car. They locked onto mine, and for a second I couldn't move. It was like the creature was waiting for me to do something, as if it knew I was there, watching. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I stood there, not sure whether to run or to stand my ground. I took a step backward, and the creature shifted, crouching lower to the ground. It was slow, deliberate, but it didn't come closer. It stayed just out of reach, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. I felt a sudden surge of fear and adrenaline. Something told me I needed to leave now. Without thinking, I yelled at it. I shouted, "Hey, Get out of here. It was the only thing I could think to do. The words sounded stupid even as they left my mouth. What did I think? That I could scare it off? But to my surprise, the creature responded. It didn't just growl or make any animal sound. It mimicked my voice, word for word, as if it was mocking me. My own voice, coming from somewhere in the dark, calling back at me. It was the same words I just said, but distorted somehow, twisted like it wasn't quite right. I was so stunned that I almost didn't react. But then, it happened again. The creature yelled back in my voice once more, and I could feel my blood run cold. There was no mistaking it this time. It wasn't just an echo. It wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was imitating me, and it was too perfect, too real. I didn't know what it was, but something told me it wasn't natural. I took a few slow, careful steps back, my mind racing. Should I run? Should I fight? There was no time to think. My body moved before my brain could process it. I turned and sprinted down the trail as fast as I could, pushing through the thick trees, the uneven ground, not daring to look back. The sound of footsteps followed me, but they were too light to be a bear, too purposeful to be a deer. It was close, but it wasn't coming after me. It was following, like it was waiting for me to make a mistake. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I ran, dodging branches and roots. After what felt like forever, I reached the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. I didn't know what I'd just seen or heard, but I knew I wasn't going back out there. Not tonight, not ever. I spent the night in the cabin, staying awake, staring out the windows, waiting for any sign of movement in the trees. But nothing happened. No more sounds, no more glowing eyes. It was quiet again, like nothing had ever been there. The next morning, I gathered my things, packed up, and left as quickly as I could. I didn't even look back when I walked down the path to the car. I told myself it was probably just some wild animal, a deer or something, playing tricks on my mind in the dark. But I knew it wasn't. The eyes, the way it mimicked my voice, the feeling of being watched. It was something else, something that didn't belong in those woods. To this day, I can't explain it, but I know I'll never go back to that cabin or that trail. Whatever it was, I don't want to know more. I don't care if it was a skinwalker or some other kind of creature. It was real, and I'm just glad I made it out of there alive. The night I spent in that cabin still haunts me. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quick getaway. Just me, a couple of days in the mountains, trying to clear my head. I had rented a cabin in a small, secluded part of the woods in northern Ontario, a place not far from where my family used to go camping when I was a kid. The cabin had that rustic charm to it, with wooden beams on the ceiling and old furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. It felt like stepping into another time, quiet and peaceful, the kind of place where you could forget about the world. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The sky was a mixture of deep blues and purples, the perfect backdrop for a relaxing evening. The cabin was small, just one room with a kitchenette, a tiny bathroom, and a wood-burning stove. It was exactly what I needed, isolated and peaceful, tucked away far enough from any other cabins or roads that I wouldn't have to worry about anyone else. After unloading my car and settling in, I made a small fire in the stove and threw on a pot of soup I had brought with me. I hadn't planned on doing much besides relaxing, maybe taking a walk through the woods tomorrow. But that night something was different. There was a stillness in the air, an almost unnatural quiet. It wasn't just the usual silence of the woods. It felt like the world itself had stopped. Even the wind had died down, leaving only the crackling of the fire to fill the space. I didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to the isolation of the place. I sat on the couch, eating my soup, trying to lose myself in the pages of a book. But every so often, I would hear something, just the faintest sound, like a twig snapping or a rustle in the trees outside. It wasn't enough to make me feel truly uneasy, but it was enough to make me aware of how alone I was. After a while, I finished my meal, put the dishes away, and decided to head to bed. The cabin was dark now, save for the soft glow of the dying fire. I closed the curtains, made sure the door was locked, and crawled into bed, pulling the blankets tight around me. I kept the lantern on low by the bedside, a small comfort against the complete darkness outside. The bed creaked as I shifted, the sound of the wooden frame settling into place. I had almost fallen asleep when I heard it again, a faint rustling sound. This time it was coming from just outside the cabin. I froze, holding my breath. The sound was soft, like someone or something moving around just beyond the door. It lasted for a few seconds and then stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, or something else rummaging around. After all, this was the woods, and it wasn't uncommon for wildlife to wander into campsites or cabins. But there was something about the way the sound stopped so suddenly that made me uneasy. It was too deliberate, almost like whatever it was knew I was inside. I lay there for a while, staring into the darkness, listening, but nothing else came. The sound didn't return, and after a few minutes, I started to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. The cabin was old, the wind could have been moving the trees, or it could have been an animal just passing through. I was overthinking it, I decided. I tried to fall asleep again, but my mind wouldn't let go of that nagging feeling. I kept thinking about how quiet it was outside, too quiet, and the way the air felt thick, like something was pressing down on the woods, making everything still. Eventually, I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside and sunlight streaming through the cracks in the wooden blinds. I felt better after a few hours of sleep, but the unease from the night before still lingered in the back of my mind. I decided to go for a walk, get some fresh air, and try to clear my head. The cabin was located at the edge of a small forest, and a trail wound through the trees, leading to a nearby lake. I figured it would be a good way to shake off the feeling of being watched. The air was crisp, and the sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the ground. As I walked along the trail, I tried to lose myself in the beauty of the woods. The trees were tall and thick, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. The sound was calming, soothing, and for a while, I managed to forget about the strange noises from the night before. I reached the lake after about an hour of walking. The water was still, like a mirror, reflecting the trees and the sky in perfect symmetry. I sat on a large rock at the water's edge, taking in the view and letting my mind wander. But even as I sat there, enjoying the moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept telling myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. There was no reason to be afraid. But then I heard it again, a faint noise from behind me, a soft crack of a twig snapping. I turned quickly, but the woods behind me were empty, just a wall of trees and underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I considered heading back to the cabin. But I didn't want to be paranoid. I told myself that I was just hearing things, that it was probably another animal, and that I should enjoy the peace while I could. The walk back to the cabin was uneventful, but as I neared the front door, something caught my eye. There, lying in the dirt just outside the porch, was a small, broken branch. It was fresh, still wet from being snapped, and it was right in front of the door, like someone had deliberately placed it there. I bent down to pick it up, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I realized something. There was no reason for anyone to be near the cabin. I was supposed to be completely alone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the branch in my hand, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it had fallen there by accident. but the feeling of being watched returned in full force. I quickly went inside, locked the door, and decided that I was going to leave the next morning. It wasn't worth staying, not with that strange feeling hanging over me. That evening, I did everything I could to keep myself busy. I cooked another meal, read more of my book, and tried to relax. But the feeling of being watched never left. It was like the woods themselves were pressing in around the cabin, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there. When night fell, I made sure the fire was good and hot in the stove. I closed all the windows and curtains, checked the door twice to make sure it was locked, and crawled into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside made me jump. Every gust of wind, every crack of the trees. I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone or something was out there, waiting. I don't know what time it was when I finally heard it again, but this time it wasn't a rustle or a crack. It was a soft, steady thumping sound. It came from somewhere near the back of the cabin, just outside my bedroom window. Thump, thump, thump. I lay there, motionless, listening to the sound grow louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart hammered in my chest. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was out there. I couldn't think straight. I wanted to grab the phone and call for help, but there was no signal. I was alone, and if something happened, no one would know. The thumping continued, slow and steady, like footsteps in the dirt. It was so close now, I could almost hear the breathing of whatever or whoever was out there. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Dead silence. I didn't move. I waited, my eyes wide open in the dark, my breath shallow. The silence was so thick it felt suffocating. Then, without warning, I heard a loud crash, a window shattering from the back of the cabin. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, climbing through the broken glass. My heart raced as I scrambled out of bed. There was no time to think, no time to prepare. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the door. My mind raced, but I had only one thought: get out. I slowly unlatched the door, my heart in my throat. The moment I stepped outside, I bolted toward the woods. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. The cabin was empty when they sent someone to check it out the next day. No signs of forced entry, no trace of whoever or whatever had been outside. But the broken window was real. The feeling of being watched was real. And I don't think I'll ever be able to explain what happened that night. But I'll never go back to that cabin. Not ever. It was one of those weekends you don't forget. The kind you spend in the middle of nowhere with nothing but nature surrounding you. I was at the cabin, deep in the woods with my cousin Jake. The place is on a 100-acre plot of land we've had in the family for decades. The cabin sits near the river, with thick forest on all sides. It's off the grid, completely isolated. The only way in is a dirt road that only we know about, and there's a massive I-beam gate we lock every time we leave. No neighbors, nothing. Just trees, the river, and the occasional wildlife like black bears or coyotes. But nothing to really worry about. At least that's what I thought. We had been enjoying the night, just the two of us, having a couple of beers and playing cribbage. The music was low, filling the quiet air with a laid-back vibe. There's something calming about being out there, far from anything. No cars, no streetlights, just the sound of the wind and the occasional call of an owl. It was the perfect way to unwind. It was getting late, probably close to midnight. I was losing the game, but I didn't mind. Jake had that smug look on his face, and I was about to call it a night. The fire in the stove was still going, and the warmth of it made the cold air outside feel even farther away. We didn't really have a plan to head back to the house just yet. but we were close. Both of us were getting ready to head up to the loft and crash for the night. Then it happened. The loudest banging you can imagine. The kind that rattles your bones. The back door, where there's no one, no path, no way in from the outside, was hit so hard the whole cabin shook. It wasn't just a knock or a tap. It was a full-on assault. The windows flexed with each hit, like something or someone was trying to get through. The sound was deafening, like a battering ram was being used on the door. My cousin's face went pale, and I could feel my heart slam in my chest. Both of us froze, staring at the door like it was some kind of enemy. My mind couldn't process what was happening. Who would be out there? What could make that noise? Jake quickly reached over and turned off the music. The silence after that was terrifying. No music, no chatter. Just the soft crackling of the fire and the sudden stillness. But the silence wasn't normal. It was deep, unnatural. There were no crickets, no frogs, no rustling in the trees. Felt like the world had stopped. We both stayed perfectly still, not even breathing, listening. The seconds stretched into what felt like forever. It was so quiet I could hear my pulse in my ears. I felt like something was right outside the door, just waiting. After what seemed like an eternity, the woods outside began to return to their usual noises, slowly. A few crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind, but something didn't feel right. The stillness, the way everything stopped so suddenly, it was off. That alone sent a shiver down my spine. We sat there, unsure of what to do. Should we check? Should we lock everything up tighter? We both knew the woods could be unpredictable, but this felt different. After what felt like a long pause, Jake whispered, "Let's take a look." I nodded, though I didn't really want to move. He grabbed a flashlight from the table, and I grabbed the pocket knife I always kept nearby. We tiptoed over to the window, careful not to make a sound. I peered through the curtains, my breath held. Outside was nothing but darkness, just pitch black. The flashlight beam cut through it, but all I saw was trees and more trees. It wasn't the animals I was worried about. It was the feeling that someone was watching us. "Did you see that?" Jake asked quietly. I turned to look at him. His face was tense, eyes wide. "What?" I thought I saw eyes, just for a second. He pointed towards the darkness, his hand shaking slightly. I didn't see anything. There was just nothing out there, just blackness. But the way Jake looked, he wasn't lying. He seemed sure. I don't know what it was, but I felt that sudden rush of cold, like we weren't alone. We decided to double-check everything, checking every lock on every door and window. There was no way in, but that banging, it was hard to forget. Whatever had done that wasn't going to give up easily. We moved upstairs to the loft, where we could hear anything coming. But we didn't sleep. We just laid there, the cold creeping up our spines, the only sound the soft wind against the walls. We didn't dare close our eyes. The night dragged on, the hours ticking by in absolute silence. Neither of us spoke. We barely moved. Every creak in the cabin, every rustle outside made us jump. But nothing else happened. No more banging, no more noise. It was like the world had decided to leave us alone after that one terrifying moment. By the time daylight started to creep over the trees, we didn't need to say anything. We were both already thinking the same thing. We had to get out of there. When we finally made it down to the back door, the damage was clear. The door was dented, badly. It was a heavy metal door, and the dents were deep. Something had hit it with so much force that the jamb was starting to crack. We had to replace the whole thing. There was no way we could leave it like that. We didn't talk much on the drive back, both of us replaying the night in our heads. The banging, the silence, Jake's eyes in the dark. I don't know what happened that night, but I'm sure it wasn't anything normal. We've been back a few times since then, but I'll never forget that feeling of not being alone, of hearing something trying to get in, and not knowing why. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a coyote. There was no logical explanation, and we couldn't figure out who else would be crazy enough to come all the way out to the cabin at that hour. But whatever it was, I'm pretty sure it was watching us. And I don't know if it was just the isolation or the feeling that something or someone was out there waiting. But I know I haven't felt the same about that cabin since. Sometimes when I'm back out there, I hear a sound that's almost the same as the one we heard that night. And it makes me remember. I'm not sure if I'll ever know what really happened that night, but I won't ever forget the feeling of being watched, the terror of hearing that banging. And I won't be the one to test the limits of the woods again. Not unless I have to. It was late in the evening, the kind of quiet that feels heavy on your chest, like the world itself was holding its breath. I had come to this remote cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway, needing some time to escape the noise of daily life. It was a small cabin, nestled between towering pines, far enough away from the nearest town that there was no light pollution, no cars whizzing by, just the stillness of nature. I'd rented it from an older couple who lived on the other side of the lake, and they had told me the area was peaceful. I needed that peace. The cabin was rustic, but comfortable. The floors creaked with every step, and the scent of wood and campfire lingered in the air. It had a stone fireplace that crackled with warmth, and the furniture was worn, but it had character. Outside, the dark had settled in quickly. There was no moon tonight, just a blanket of stars scattered across the sky like tiny diamonds. I spent most of the evening reading a book by the fire. I wasn't in a rush to do anything. It was nice not to be connected to anything. No phones, no work emails, just the flicker of flames and the whisper of the wind outside. I had dinner, something simple, pasta with tomato sauce, a glass of wine, and then I just listened. The usual sounds of the woods surrounded me. Rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, the soft calls of night birds. But then, there was something different, a sound I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was the wind picking up, but it was too rhythmic. It wasn't long before the noise came again, louder this time. I walked to the window, peering through the dark, trying to see what could be causing it. The sound was coming from just outside the cabin door. I stepped back, unsure if I wanted to investigate. The last thing I wanted was to stir up a bear or some other wild animal. But the curiosity gnawed at me. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I cautiously made my way to the door. I hesitated, hand on the knob, and then the sound came again, this time clearer. It sounded like something was hitting the door repeatedly. I froze. It wasn't the scratching or clawing I'd expect from a raccoon or some other critter trying to get in. It was a rhythmic thud, like wings beating against wood. My heart raced. An owl? It seemed strange, but I couldn't think of anything else. Maybe the light from inside had drawn some small animal, and the owl, attracted by the movement, had flown into the door, desperate to catch its prey. I wasn't sure what else would be out there, doing that kind of damage. I waited for a moment, listening. The air had suddenly gone completely still. Not even the wind stirred. It was as if the whole forest had gone silent. That in itself was unsettling. Nature doesn't just stop. Birds don't just stop calling out in the night. And yet, everything was quiet. The only sound left was the repeated thuds of the owl's wings against the door. I slowly opened the door, flashlight in hand, ready to shine it into the dark. The cold night air hit me instantly, and I stepped out onto the porch. The owl wasn't far. It had perched on the edge of the roof, flapping its wings as it tried to figure out how to get to whatever had caught its attention. Its enormous shape silhouetted against the dark sky was eerie, like something out of a nightmare. I had never seen such a big bird up close before. A great horned owl. Its feathers were a mix of dark brown and gray, with those striking tufts that made it look almost menacing. It wasn't the owl that bothered me, though. It was the feeling of being watched. As I stood there, holding the flashlight in my shaking hands, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The stillness of the woods felt unnatural. The owl wasn't moving now, just staring at me with those piercing yellow eyes. I couldn't help but feel that something else was out there. Something watching, waiting. Suddenly, the owl launched itself into the air with a violent flap of its wings, causing me to jump back. It was gone, swallowed by the dark. But the silence remained. Not even a breeze rustled through the trees. I should have gone inside and locked the door, but I couldn't bring myself to. My instincts told me something wasn't right. I stood there for a few more minutes, the flashlight trembling in my hand, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. The woods around me seemed so empty, and that feeling was worse than any animal encounter. It was like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. I wasn't sure what, but I felt like I was at the center of it, like I wasn't supposed to be here. That's when I heard it. A soft rustle like leaves shifting, but it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the side of the cabin, near the back. I turned the flashlight that way, but the beam didn't reach far enough to reveal anything. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the creeping fear that I couldn't shake, or maybe it was the thought that whatever was lurking out there wouldn't show itself unless I looked. But I decided to check. I walked along the side of the cabin, the ground crunching under my boots. The air felt heavier, colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. By the time I reached the corner, the rustling stopped. I waited for a moment, listening. Nothing. I was just about to turn back when I saw something move in the shadows. It was quick, too quick to make sense of. I aimed the flashlight in that direction, but all I saw was the glimmer of eyes reflecting the light. For a split second, I thought I saw the outline of a larger animal, too big to be a raccoon, too quick to be a deer. The noise came again. This time, it wasn't a rustle. It was a heavy thud, like something large hitting the ground. My heart skipped a beat. I backed away, inching toward the porch, but my foot caught on a rock, sending me stumbling backward. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the ground, its beam lighting up the space in front of me for just a second. In that brief moment, I saw something move in the shadows again, too fast for me to see clearly. I didn't waste any more time. I sprinted for the door, flung it open, and slammed it shut behind me. My hands fumbled as I locked it. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, heart racing. The cabin was silent again, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, like something was waiting just outside. I grabbed the fireplace poker, just in case, and stood by the door. The rest of the night passed without any more incidents, though I didn't sleep. I kept hearing sounds outside, the occasional thud, the rustle of leaves, but nothing close enough to be certain about. At dawn, I finally gathered the courage to step outside and inspect the area. The ground was undisturbed, but the door was still marked with faint scratches from the owl's wings. That was it. I left the cabin early that morning, feeling a weight lift off me the farther I got from the place. I didn't understand what had happened, but I knew I wouldn't be coming back. The woods had been too still, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all night. Maybe it had been the owl. Maybe it had been something else. Either way, I knew I wasn't meant to stay in that cabin any longer. It was early autumn in the high desert of New Mexico, the kind of place where the wind always seems to be moving and the sky stretches out in every direction. My husband, Mike, and I had just moved out here, hoping for a little peace and some space. Our new property was remote, just a few miles from the nearest town. The land itself was beautiful, wide, open, and almost untouched. It was the perfect place to try out our new off-the-grid lifestyle. The plan was simple. We were going to live out here for a while, build a cabin eventually, and see what kind of life we could carve out. The first night Mike left, he took the truck into town to grab some supplies, leaving me alone on the property for a while. I'd stayed with him on other trips, but this was the first time I was really on my own here. It felt strange, being surrounded by so much emptiness, and yet I knew I was safe. After all, how bad could a little bit of isolation be? The first thing I did when Mike left was set up camp in the same spot we had set up our tent a few days earlier. The wind was picking up, as it often did in the evenings, sending little dust devils across the land and making the trees in the distance bend in strange ways. It was already starting to get dark when I decided I needed to relieve myself. We hadn't built a bathroom yet, so our solution had been simple: a couple of cinder blocks with a plank of wood over it, tucked behind a small ridge. I didn't mind it, but I had to admit that the idea of being out there at night alone gave me a little unease. I walked out into the dark, armed with only a flashlight and my nerves. The tent felt far behind me, and as I squatted down over the makeshift toilet, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The wind had picked up, howling in the distance. It felt like the entire desert was holding its breath. That's when it happened. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it, a horrible, piercing shriek that cut through the silence. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie, the kind of noise you don't forget. It wasn't just loud. It was unnatural, the kind of sound that grabs hold of your very bones. I froze, my body going completely stiff. My heart thudded in my chest as the sound seemed to come closer. It wasn't just a scream, it was a shriek, like a banshee or something worse. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone. I jumped up from the toilet, stumbling as I tried to regain my balance. My flashlight went flying and landed somewhere in the dirt. My muscles locked up, and I felt a cold rush of terror flood through me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I stood there in the darkness, trying to understand what I was hearing. It sounded like it was getting closer, moving fast, almost as if it was chasing me. I turned and bolted back toward the tent, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. I could barely breathe as I fumbled for the tent zipper. Finally, I yanked it open and dove inside, not even bothering to close it properly. I was shaking, my mind spinning, my thoughts a blur. The shriek had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made that noise was still out there, watching me. I crawled into the corner of the tent, clutching my phone with trembling hands. My heart wouldn't slow down, and every little rustle of wind or shift of the tent fabric made my blood run cold. I tried to gather my thoughts, replaying the sound over and over in my head. What could it have been? Was it an animal? The shriek sounded too human, too intelligent. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, and I had been out here long enough to know what wildlife sounded like in the desert. Nothing had ever screamed like that. Nothing ever made a noise like that in these parts. After a few minutes, I pulled myself together enough to text Mike. My fingers were still unsteady as I typed out a message to him. Screech owl. I'm 1000% sure it was a screech OWL, and it scared the crap back into me. I hit send and waited, trying to steady my breath. The stillness of the desert outside seemed almost oppressive now. The wind was quieter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the phone again and saw Mike's reply. You mean scared the crap out of you, right? I let out a nervous laugh, despite myself. I had been joking with him earlier that day about an owl we had seen, one that had looked off. It had been a strange sight. A molting owl, its feathers in tatters, flying erratically like it wasn't quite sure how to navigate. We had both laughed, assuming it was sick or just going through some weird stage. But that sound, it couldn't have been from that owl. Could it? I thought back to the time we had spent out here, the quiet days filled with the distant hum of the earth, the occasional hawk's cry, the low whistle of the wind through the sparse desert trees. It wasn't a place for sounds that could turn your blood cold. Not like that. I couldn't help but wonder what else might be out here, what other creatures might lurk in the shadows. The hours stretched on, each minute a little harder to get through. My eyes flicked to the flashlight lying somewhere outside the tent, but I couldn't bring myself to go back out there. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, maybe just a branch snapping or the rustle of some small animal in the brush, but it was enough to keep me on edge. The silence between those sounds was thick, pressing down on me. I kept thinking of the owl, trying to convince myself that it had been nothing more than that. Mike didn't get back to me right away. I assumed he was still on the road, maybe having trouble with the truck, but that didn't stop me from checking my phone every few minutes. I had to know he was okay, that he was still on his way back. When he finally responded, hours later, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. He had sent me a series of texts with some kind of joke, but I didn't find it funny. All I could think about was how I had been alone out here, vulnerable, hearing that shriek in the dark. We agreed that I'd stay inside the tent for the night, and he would get back as soon as he could. By the time he finally arrived, the night had passed and the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale orange glow over the desert. It felt like a new day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, like the desert had whispered something to me, and I had heard it. Mike wasn't too concerned when he arrived, just happy I was okay. But when I told him what had happened, he paused. "Could have been an owl," he said, as though it was the most logical explanation in the world. But I knew better. Later that day, we walked out together to look for signs of what had caused that noise. We checked the area around the makeshift toilet, the nearby ridge, and everything else within a few hundred feet. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just dry desert, scattered rocks, and the occasional brush that had been moved by the wind. No tracks, no sign of anything unusual. But as I stood there, looking over the land, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there. Something I couldn't see but could feel. Something that had watched me the night before. And maybe it was an owl. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it wasn't just the noise that had scared me. It was the way I couldn't explain it. How it had been so strange, so wrong. And the desert, that vast, open space, somehow felt emptier, as if it was hiding something from me. We decided to go on with our plans, build the cabin, get the property ready for more permanent living. But every so often, when I'm out there alone, I'll hear a rustle in the wind, or a noise that doesn't quite belong, and I remember that shriek. The desert is full of mysteries. Some of them, I think, are meant to stay buried. It was a cold autumn evening when I decided to take a solo trip to a remote cabin I'd rented for the weekend. I needed a break from the chaos of city life, the constant noise, and the never-ending stress. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization, and I figured it would be the perfect place to clear my head and unwind. I wasn't much of a camper, but I enjoyed the occasional hike and the quiet solitude that came with being alone in nature. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with trees on either side, their leaves turning brilliant shades of orange and yellow. I was excited to get there, but as I got closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The air felt colder than it should have been for October, and the sky above me was a dull, overcast gray. It was the kind of weather that made the forest look even more vast and foreboding, the trees casting long, twisted shadows across the dirt road. I finally arrived at the cabin just as the sun was beginning to set. It was a small, one-story building with a rustic charm to it, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. The cabin had an old, weathered look, like it had been there for decades, though it had been well kept. The wood of the walls and the roof was dark, almost black in the fading light, and there was a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs. I unloaded my things and took a quick walk around the property. There was a small stream nearby, its water bubbling over smooth rocks. The area was beautiful, quiet, and peaceful. I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I took in the scenery. It was exactly what I needed. After dinner, I settled in for the night. The cabin had a wood-burning stove, and I made a fire to keep warm. I sat in the cozy armchair by the fireplace, reading a book as the flames crackled and popped. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, but inside, it was warm and peaceful. The sound of the wind was almost soothing, like a lullaby. But as the night went on, something felt off. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a general unease that seemed to settle over me like a heavy blanket. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, or the quiet that I wasn't used to. But then I heard it. A noise, soft at first, barely audible over the wind. It was a tapping sound, like someone knocking on the door. I froze, my heart racing. I didn't expect anyone to be out here, not this far from town. The road was narrow, and the cabin was too secluded for anyone to just wander by. I told myself it was probably just a branch hitting the door in the wind. But then the tapping came again, this time louder. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Should I check? Should I ignore it? My instincts told me to be cautious, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the door. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob. Before I opened it, just a crack. Nothing. The porch was empty. The wind howled, and the trees swayed in the darkness. But there was no sign of anyone. I let out a sigh of relief and closed the door, locking it behind me. It was probably nothing, maybe just an animal or the wind playing tricks on me. I went back to my chair, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air in the cabin felt thicker, almost oppressive. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard to concentrate on my book. The tapping returned, louder this time, and it came from the window, not the door. I jumped to my feet again, my heart pounding. I turned off the light and peeked through the curtain. There was nothing out there, just the trees swaying in the wind. I wasn't sure what to do. The logical part of me said it was just my imagination, or maybe an animal moving around outside. But another part of me was beginning to panic. It felt like I wasn't alone, like someone or something was out there, watching me. The tapping continued intermittently, now coming from the windows and the door, always at strange intervals, never consistent. I couldn't figure out if it was an animal or something else, but the sound was unnerving, especially with the silence that surrounded it. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was the occasional tapping, like it was trying to get my attention. I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. I grabbed my coat, flashlight, and car keys, ready to leave. But as I stepped outside, I froze. There, just a few feet from the porch, was a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall, thin, and hunched over, almost as if it were waiting for me. I couldn't make out any details. It was too dark, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I quickly stepped back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I leaned against the door, trying to calm myself. I couldn't explain what had just happened. My mind was racing, but there was no clear explanation for it. The cabin felt suffocating now, like the walls were closing in on me. I had to get out of there. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for whatever it was to come after me. I grabbed my bag, shoved my phone into my pocket, and rushed to the door again. But before I could open it, there was another sound, a loud bang, like something heavy slamming against the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. A shadow darting across the window, moving fast. I backed away from the door, my mind racing for a plan. I didn't know if I should leave or stay, but the thought of facing whatever was outside was worse than staying inside, even if it meant being trapped. Then I heard the tapping again, but this time it was coming from the roof. It was slow, deliberate, like something was pacing up there. I didn't know how to explain it, but I knew I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. I made my way to the back door and stepped outside into the dark night. The air was freezing, and the ground was wet with dew. The sound of the tapping stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I ran toward my car, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. But as I reached it, I saw something that froze me in place. There, by the side of the road, were two figures standing just beyond the headlights. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by hoods. My heart thudded in my chest. There was nowhere to go, no way to escape. I couldn't outrun them, and I had no idea if they were armed or dangerous. But just as I started to panic, the figures moved, not toward me, but away, disappearing into the trees like they were never there at all. I didn't wait around to find out what happened next. I jumped in my car and sped off, the tires screeching as I tore down the dirt road, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my heart still racing in my chest. The next day, I called the cabin's owner to report what had happened. He was kind but didn't seem overly concerned. He mentioned that the cabin had been there for years, and there were occasional reports of people seeing strange figures in the woods. But he assured me it was all just local folklore, nothing to worry about. But I knew what I saw and what I felt. The tapping, the shadows, the figures in the woods. There was something out there, and it was watching me. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. The woods, the silence, the isolation, they all seemed peaceful at first. But now, I can't shake the feeling that something is always watching, waiting, just beyond the trees.